Good morning. I'm Eve Studi. I'm lead nutritionist of nutrition guidance at USDA's Center for Nutrition Policy and Promotion and designated federal officer to the 2020 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee. I want to welcome everyone to the second meeting of the Advisory Committee. We have over 1,000 people who have registered for this meeting, with around 300 registered to attend in person and over 700 online. Thank you for your interest in the dietary guidelines. The meeting will be today from 9 to 4:30 and tomorrow from 8:30 to 12:30. And Dr. Schneeman will do an overview of the agenda in just a moment. Now, a few housekeeping items. For those of you here in person, you will notice that each of us has a badge, and you will need this badge or a USDA badge in order to access the halls of the building. So please keep your badge visible at all times, and it designates to security that you are a part of this group. You'll also notice that some of the badges say staff, and if you have any questions, please see a member of the staff. If you'd like any refreshments or lunch, the USDA cafeteria we're in Wing 5, take a right, and it's at Wing 3. This is a meeting of the committee, and all meetings of the full committee are open to the public. 15 of our 20 members are here with us today. I do want to welcome in person Drs. Donovan and Naomi, who were not able to join us for the first public meeting. Drs. Davis, Dewey, Heimsfeld, Meyer-Davis, and Stang were not able to join us today, but we do have a quorum of members for today's deliberations. Throughout your deliberations, we ask the members to state your name prior to speaking so that everyone can follow the conversation. As a quick reminder, the 2020 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee has been established to conduct an independent review of current research on nutrition and health to be considered by the Departments of Agriculture and Health and Human Services in the development of the next edition of the Dietary Guidelines. Specifically, the charge of the committee, as outlined in its charter, is to examine the evidence on specific topics and questions identified by the departments, and these topics and questions will be discussed throughout today's presentations. The topics and questions were identified by USDA and HHS following a process of federal and public input and prioritized based on 4 criteria: relevance and importance to developing public health guidance, potential federal impact, and avoiding duplication. Following its review, the committee will develop a report that outlines its science-based review and recommendations to the departments. And then they will submit its report to the Secretaries of Agriculture and Health and Human Services for consideration as the departments develop the next edition of the Dietary Guidelines. The committee has the very important role of describing the state of current nutrition science. Each edition of the Dietary Guidelines that USDA and HHS develop in our partnership builds upon the previous edition with scientific justification for changes informed by the committee's scientific report, along with input from the public and federal agencies. To give you a sense for where we are in the process, this is the second of 5 meetings of the Advisory Committee. The last committee meeting will be in March of next year, and the departments request the committee's report by May of 2020. And this is so that USDA and HHS can meet our mandate to release the next edition of the Dietary Guidelines within 5 years, which means we need to release it by December of 2020. As you can see on this slide, there are multiple opportunities for public input in this process, including comments on the topics and questions the committee is addressing, a public call for nominations for committee membership, public comments throughout the committee's deliberations, which is ongoing now, and in spring of 2020, a call for comments on the committee's final scientific report once they submit it to the Secretaries of USDA and HHS. If you haven't done so already, please save the dates for the remaining public meetings. During this meeting, actually tomorrow, and during meeting 4, there will be opportunity for oral comments to the committee from the public. Meeting 4 will be held outside of Washington, D.C. in Houston, Texas. And registration for each meeting will be announced about 1 month prior to the meeting date at dietaryguidelines.gov and through our listserv. So please do sign up for our listserv updates at dietaryguidelines.gov if you haven't already done so. More information on the committee, including the protocols they will be discussing today, can be found at dietaryguidelines.gov under Work Underway, and we encourage you to follow along. So with that, I'm now going to turn the meeting over to the committee, which is chaired by Dr. Barbara Schneeman. Dr. Schneeman?
Great, thank you, Eve. So my understanding is they will adjust the microphones to make sure it's heard, so let me know if there's a problem. So first of all, let me add my welcome to that from USDA and HHS to the committee members. It's great to see you all in person again, and also to the public who are either here at USDA in the auditorium or watching online. My remarks, this brief opening, is intended to review the agenda for today and tomorrow so that I can focus then on what we hope to achieve in this second public meeting. And part of our goal then is to share within the committee the tremendous amount of work that has been done by the subcommittee since our first meeting. Most of today's meeting will be reports of the work done by the subcommittees and then discussion by the full committee. So in the next several slides, I'll provide you an orientation to the subcommittee presentations, defining key terms and elements of the protocols, and describing the standard NESR criteria that apply across the various protocols. So since meeting one, the subcommittees have met by teleconference frequently. I think you were all promised a significant amount of work at the first meeting, and I think we've followed through on that, and it won't change. And so each committee then has discussed the specific questions that it will address. They've received some additional training on the approaches to examine the evidence, and they've identified the order in which they will develop their protocols for the specific topics. And then they've actually drafted protocols for some or all of its questions, and those are the ones that will be brought to the full committee for discussion today. So these are the subcommittee, the topic areas, and I realize you probably can't read that very well, but just to remind you, the topic areas for the subcommittees are dietary patterns, pregnancy and lactation, birth to 24 months, beverages and added sugars, dietary fats and seafood, and frequency of eating. And then there's one cross-cutting working group on the data analysis and food pattern modeling, and that cuts across all of them. So this gives you the subcommittee members, but you'll get more details on that with each subcommittee presentation. And also there'll be information on the USDA and HHS staff that has supported the work of the committee and really helped the subcommittees make a tremendous amount of progress since our first meeting. So just as another reminder of the way that the committee, the advisory committee, is structuring its work, it's using one of three approaches to examine the evidence: data analysis, food pattern modeling, and the NESR systematic reviews. And those reviews are either original reviews conducted by the committee or using or updating existing NESR systematic reviews. And again, for everything, there's always additional information at dietaryguidelines.gov. So for each approach that's used, there's a protocol that details how the methodology is being applied to a specific question. So the protocols then are a plan for how one of the scientific approaches will be used, and there's a protocol for each question. And those protocols are created before the committee looks at the evidence, again, to be objective in how we approach each of the scientific questions. Those protocols are posted online for the public to view and better understand that the approach that the committee is using. At this point, for this meeting, we have 40 protocols that have been drafted by the subcommittees for discussion across the full committee today. So to look at the components then of the protocols, this just reminds you of the various pieces of the protocol. There's an analytic framework, inclusion-exclusion criteria, the search strategy, and then the flow chart for the literature search and screening, the included articles, excluded articles with their rationale. So in our discussion of the subcommittees today, we're really going to be looking at the analytical framework and the inclusion and exclusion criteria, with the goal that we're trying to finalize these protocols so that they can be implemented. And as they are implemented, the protocols online will be updated with the additional information. So just then to look at those components, the analytical framework defines the core elements of the diet and health relationship that's being examined, and it then serves as the foundation for the rest of the systematic review process. It informs the inclusion-exclusion criteria in the literature search, it directs the data extraction and risk of bias assessment, and guides the strategy for synthesizing the evidence. Next slide gives a template that the committee members should be quite familiar with by now, and you will see many more of them today, and you'll see this template over and over again. And it gives the key components of the analytical framework: the intervention or exposure and the comparator that's being used, and the population of interest for the specific question that's being examined. And it then has either and/or intermediate outcomes or health outcomes, depending on the nature of the question. And it also then includes key factors that could impact the relationship, so co-founders and other covariates or other moderators. These analytical frameworks will also include any key terms that need to be defined for the specific question. And the subcommittees have really worked to try and make sure we have some consistent terminology where appropriate. But then, of course, each analytical framework has been tailored. And so I'm trying to cover the general pieces so that the subcommittees can then focus on how they've tailored the analytical framework for their work. So looking then at the inclusion and exclusion criteria, these again are established up front so that they can be objective, consistent, and transparent in identifying the articles that will be included in each review. They're also looked at to make sure that they're relevant for U.S. federal policy. And standard criteria for the inclusion and exclusion criteria are applied wherever possible. However, some criteria do need to be tailored to the specific review. And this just gives some examples. Diet-related intervention, exposures of interest, health outcomes, endpoints and/or intermediate outcomes, the dates of publication, size of the study groups, study duration, age of the study participants. Those are the examples of things that might need to be tailored to a specific protocol. So then this slide is a reminder that these are generally items that can be standardized across the protocol. So in terms of the study design, the kinds of studies that have been included in the, will be included in the systematic reviews, and the types of studies that will be excluded from the systematic reviews. The focus is on peer-reviewed publications, publications that are published in English. And in terms of countries, we're looking at very high or high human development, so it's comparable to the U.S. population. And obviously, we're focused on studies that have been conducted in humans. So just to the types of things that dictate what studies get included. Now, where there might be more tailoring within a particular protocol looks at the health status of study participants. And part of this is guided by the overall purpose of the dietary guidelines, which is to provide recommendations about reducing risk for chronic disease and promoting health in the general population. And we recognize that sometimes that means including individuals who are at risk, but these are not about management of disease or treatment of disease. So included are participants who are healthy, but it may include some subjects who are at risk or might have been diagnosed with a particular outcome. But it would exclude any studies where the exclusive focus of the study was treatment or management of individuals who've already been diagnosed or who have already been designated as having the outcome of interest. And that we'll see that applied as appropriate across the various protocols. Likewise with infants, the focus is on full term, but it can include some infants who are low birth weight, small for gestational age, but it would exclude studies where that was the exclusive focus of the particular study. And again, we'll hear more detail on that as we go into individual protocols. So of the protocols that we're going to talk about today, 35 out of the 40 will be focused on the systematic review protocols. So that's the bulk of what we'll be hearing. But we have 5 questions that will use the data analysis framework. And again, just like with the systematic reviews, the data analysis also develops a protocol for each of its questions. And so the framework describes the overall scope of the question. The plan details the data and the subsequent analysis that are included and the analytical results. And so today, our focus will be on the framework and on the plan for those 5 questions. And again, as the protocols are implemented, they will be updated on the website. So in today's agenda then, we'll be going through the subcommittee presentations, and we've allocated 45 minutes for each of the subcommittees with the idea that we'll have a presentation from the subcommittee chair, but then also have time for discussion amongst the committee to raise comments, ask questions. And the order of the presentations will be the data analysis and food pattern modeling, the dietary pattern subcommittee, the frequency of eating, pregnancy and lactation, the birth to 24 months, beverages and added sugars, dietary fats, and seafood. And this is the order that we've projected. We've given you a tentative agenda. However, the specific times may vary and be subject to change based on the nature of the work and the discussion that we need to go through. Oh, and I should comment as well that the committee has the protocols in their notebook, so you have a reference material in front of you, but all of the protocols are available online, so if anyone needs further information, you can get that online. So each committee then subcommittee will review its work. It's going to describe the order it's developing its protocols, which questions it's dealing with now, which questions it's left for future. It'll review the protocols themselves and how they've been tailored to address the question and address the topic that's been given to it and outline its next steps. We're asking that you keep the remarks at a high level so that there is time for discussion within the committee for the protocols. And again, you all have them in your binders. So just to remind you then, for tomorrow's agenda, the focus will be on comments from the public to the advisory committee. At this point, since March, we've received 7,000 comments, and the public may have comments specific to the the 40 protocols that we are discussing today, and we would encourage you to submit those comments by Wednesday, July 24th, because part of the goal is to be able to start implementing these protocols so that the committee can complete its work in the time frame allocated. But as a general observation, the public comment period is open throughout the committee's work. So specific to the protocols, it's helpful to get them sooner rather than later, but it's always open for comment. So with that, and let me just ask the committee, does anyone have a question, or you want to make another observation, anything I missed about where we need to go? Okay, they're ready. Yeah. So our first report then will be Dr. Reagan Bailey, who is reporting for the cross-cutting working group, the data analysis and food pattern modeling.
Good morning, everyone. So I'm here representing Working Group 7, which is comprised of the Jamies, Dr. Jamie Yard and Jamie Stang, Dr. Teresa Davis, Dr. Tim Namey, Dr. Schneeman, and supported by Dr. Panucci at the USDA. Today we'll be describing the first 5 questions that we will be tackling in order of protocol development, and I'm not going to read them here at this point because we'll have a slide devoted to each question. The remaining questions that we have to address include beverages, added sugars, and frequency of eating, and how those relate to achieving nutrient and food group intake recommendations. We also have questions to answer regarding food pattern modeling. So are changes to the food patterns needed based on the relationships identified in your committee work and the systematic reviews? Can food patterns for those under 2 years of age be established? And finally, food pattern modeling questions related to nutrient adequacy, the use of dietary supplements and fortified foods, as well as added sugars. Before we begin, just a few key definitions. We'll be using the phrase stage of life, and for data analysis and food pattern modeling, this can mean different things. The age groups for the definition of a stage of life can differ based on the NHANES sampling weights or by the dietary reference intakes. So the age groups are not perfectly aligned in all cases. The term socioeconomic status is a broad term that we use to include income in dollars, poverty to income ratio, food security, federal food assistance programs, and level of education. And finally, a RAC. This is the reference amount customarily consumed in one occasion as determined by the FDA, and this is represented on the nutrition facts label. So our analytic framework, our population is the U.S. population. So we'll be working with nationally representative survey data. You'll see here in the blue boxes what we'll be talking about today as the B24 protocols and analytic frameworks are still under discussion. Broadly, children and adolescents are defined 2 to 19, adults 20 to 64, older adults 65 and older, and pregnant and lactating women. I'll use the term demographic subgroups quite a bit to represent that we will have the data stratified by sex, by race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, and food security status. The data sources that we have available are the What We Eat in America survey component of the NHANES. This data can be analyzed to get nutrient data on foods and beverages with the FNDDS. As Dr. Panucci described at our first meeting, we also have what's called the FPED. This gives us data on food groups and subgroups, as well as we have the What We Eat in America food categories. So these are foods as they are consumed, as well as information on nutrient intakes from dietary supplements, inclusive of antacids containing calcium or magnesium. So the first question is to describe and evaluate current intakes of food groups and nutrients. We'll be doing this looking at the mean intakes of foods and subgroups, the usual intake distributions, food category sources, food group intakes compared to existing recommendations, and changes over time. And I'll be a little bit more granular on the upcoming slides. In terms of looking at nutrient intakes, we are first looking at nutrients from foods and beverages alone. The most recent iteration of the NHANES data, right now, the dietary supplement data is not available, and so we're starting with foods and beverages alone to assess mean and usual intake distributions. We will compare those usual intake distributions to the dietary reference intakes, and we'll talk about that a little bit more detail in question 3. Food category sources of these nutrients, and then changes that occur over time. Very similar for food groups, we're looking at population averages. This is from NHANES 2015-16. And in general, when we look at the average or the mean intakes, we'll be looking at 2015-16. When we're looking at the population distribution, we have 4 years of data from 2013 to 2016. So again, as I mentioned, the percent meeting food group recommendations and changes over time. And so for food group intakes, you'll see that here with the What We Eat in America food group categories. Similarly, for nutrient intakes, we'll have the population average, we'll have the usual intake distributions, inclusive of foods and beverages and total with dietary supplements, changes in intake of nutrients over time comparing 2009-10 to 15-16, and then food category sources of those nutrients. The second question is to describe and evaluate the prevalence of nutrition-related chronic health conditions. Right now, these are the nutrition-related chronic health conditions under consideration, and I will not read these as I, again, will go through each of these in a little bit more detail in upcoming slides. The data sources that we have available, again, we have the NHANES data, that includes the dietary data, laboratory, physical, and exam data. We also have the National Health Interview Survey, or NHIS. This is from 2017. We have data from the National Vital Statistics System in 2017. We have the PRAMS data, the Pregnancy Risk Assessment Monitoring System, as well as the SEER data, which is a wonderful repository of information on cancer registry statistics in the U.S., and this is from 2016. In terms of the beta 24 group, we'll be looking at the prevalence of low and high weight for length, length for age, and weight for age. This will come from the NHANES data. We'll also be characterizing the prevalence of low birth weight among U.S. infants by race, ethnicity, and the age of the mothers using the National Vital Statistics. We have data available from NHIS on children birth to 4 years of age on the prevalence of food allergy. Looking at children 2 to 19, we're interested in characterizing the prevalence of underweight, overweight, obesity, and severe obesity using the most recent NHANES data, as well as differences in the obesity prevalence by those demographic characteristics that I mentioned earlier, those 4 components, and the degree of urbanization. We'll also be looking at changes in obesity and severe obesity between 2007-8 and 2015-16. For cardiovascular intermediate outcomes among children, we have the prevalence of hypertension, high LDL, and low HDL by the demographic subgroups, as well as by BMI status from 2013 to 2016. For children, we have data on leukemia from SEER, and from NHANES, we have data on prediabetes and type 2 diabetes from the most recent survey cycles of NHANES. For adults, similar to children, we're interested in characterizing the prevalence of underweight, overweight, obesity, and severe obesity from NHANES, as well as waist circumference and waist circumference risk, and then examining obesity by the demographic characteristics and level of urbanization. In adults, we have data from NHANES on high triglycerides, high total cholesterol, low LDL, low HDL, high LDL, excuse me, and the prevalence of hypertension. So all of that data comes from the physical exam in NHANES. From the National Health Interview Survey, we also have the age-adjusted prevalence of hypertension, coronary heart disease, and prevalence of stroke. For the type 2 diabetes and prediabetes, we will be able to have this information from 2013 through 2016 for adults. We'll also have the prevalence of metabolic syndrome. So we have the prevalence of each of the 5 individual risk factors for metabolic syndrome, but we will also have the characteristic of metabolic syndrome based on those 5 risk factors. We have data on chronic liver disease outcomes from NHIS 2017. We have age-adjusted chronic liver disease and cirrhosis from the National Vital Statistics System, as well as high ALT and AST from NHANES 2013 to 2016. We've talked as a committee about how to use the ALT and AST with regards to data on alcohol consumption, so we're exploring options about characterizing high liver enzymes relative to alcohol intake. So that's a little bit more that we'll have to discuss with what data are available and sample sizes. These 10 cancers are available to the committee through the SEER 2016 data, and we'll have information that is age-adjusted and sex-specific, both incidence and mortality. For pregnant women, we'll have the prevalence of gestational diabetes from the Vital Statistics System, as well as the PRAMS data, where we'll have information on pregnancy-induced hypertension. For older adults, we have information on low bone mass and osteoporosis. This is at the femoral neck and lumbar spine, as well as the prevalence of reduced muscle strength. And you'll see that all of these years don't perfectly overlap. That's because NHANES doesn't collect the same information every year on every topic. So there's exceptions noted on the years throughout. The third question is to describe and evaluate the nutrients of public health concern. There are no set definitions of what a nutrient of public health concern is, and the National Academy of Sciences report and this working group members agree that we should take what is being called a 3-pronged approach. So we'll look at the prevalence of inadequate and excessive nutrient intakes, comparing current distributions to the dietary reference intakes. When available, we'll consider biological endpoints or validated surrogate endpoints, such as biochemical indices of a nutrient status with validated cut points in addition to the dietary intake of nutrients. And finally, we would consider the scientific evidence on the relationship between nutrient inadequacy and excess on clinical health consequences. A few more definitions. The dietary reference intakes, as I'm sure you all know, represent a set of reference values that are established by the national academies. We have an acceptable I am so used to using the acronym, so it's hard for me to actually say these words. So it'll be a little bit of an alphabet soup. The AMDR, this is a recommended percent energy intake for macronutrients, and so we'll look below that and above that recommended range, so AMDR. The estimated average requirement, or EAR, is what we use to estimate at the population level the risk of dietary inadequacy. When we don't have scientific data that is compelling enough to establish an EAR, we have what is called an adequate intake, or an AI, and this is the level that is assumed to ensure nutritional adequacy. So in the absence of nutrients with an EAR, we have only an adequate intake, and then we have the other end of the spectrum, or the UL. So this is the maximum daily amount that is unlikely to cause adverse health consequences. With the release of the new report on sodium and potassium, we have another term to include in the DRIs. This is called the chronic disease risk reduction. This is the lowest level of intake for which sufficient strength of evidence exists to characterize a chronic disease risk reduction. So right now, the CDRR is only available for sodium. That's just the most recently updated sodium and potassium nutrients. And then finally, the term nutrients of public health concern. As I mentioned, this has been a phrase that is used throughout the guidelines to represent a nutrient that is either underconsumed or overconsumed relative to the DRI and linked in the literature with adverse health outcomes in a general population or in a population subgroup. Here is the framework, very similar to some of the previous questions. We'll have nutrient intakes from total and from foods and beverages alone. For nutrients with an EAR, we'll use the cut point method. There are some assumptions to the cut point method that the distribution of requirements are symmetrical. That assumption is violated for menstruating women for the nutrient of iron, so the full probability approach will be used for iron. Again, comparing nutrients without an EAR, we will look at those relative to the adequate intake. We will examine the prevalence of the population that exceeds the UL or the CDRR, as well as people who are the prevalence inside or outside the AMDR. For added sugars and saturated fat, we will use the 2015-2020 guidelines recommendations for less than 10% of total energy intake. In terms of the data sources for the other parameters, we have, and I'll explain in the next couple of slides, laboratory data and exam data from NHANES, the nutrient intakes as I described from What We Eat in America, and clinical health consequences that will be either evidence from the systematic reviews that you are all working on, as well as results from nutrition-related chronic health conditions. So the plan, the analytic plan for ages 1 and older, again, looking at the usual intake distribution from foods and beverages and from total inclusive of dietary supplements. In terms of the biomarkers of nutrient status in children, we would prefer to use the most recent survey years, but you'll see here there are exceptions noted, both in what years that the samples are collected and in what survey waves. So we have ferritin and transferrin. We have low folate, low red blood cell folate, low serum folate, low serum copper, low serum zinc, and low 25-hydroxy vitamin D. You'll see the survey years associated unless otherwise noted. For children 6 to 19 years, from 2003 through 2006, we have vitamin A and carotenoids, vitamin C, vitamin E, B12, and B6. Very similar in adults, we have data on transferrin and ferritin. This is in women who are 20 to 49. We have low folate, both in terms of serum and red blood cell. We have data on unmetabolized folic acid in adults, copper, zinc, vitamin D. In addition to serum B12, we have elevated methylmalonic acid in 2013-14, and among pregnant women, we have the median urinary iodine concentration. Again, at the bottom of this slide are the data on vitamin A, carotenoids, C, E, and B6. So in terms of the next question, which is to describe and evaluate the current dietary patterns on beverage consumption, this is really going to be limited to data on the Healthy Eating Index, both means and the component scores, as well as food category contributions to total intake. And this is a noted limitation. So we don't have data on self-selected dietary patterns. For example, are you a vegetarian? Do you follow a specific dietary pattern? We really have the Healthy Eating Index 2015 as how we will evaluate dietary patterns based on the availability of data. In terms of beverage consumption, we'll look at the types of beverages being consumed, the percent consuming on a given day, the volume, variations in beverage consumption, and then how those beverage types contribute to energy, macronutrients, micronutrients, as well as added sugar. So a beverage pattern here can be defined as the quantities, proportions, varieties, and combinations of different beverages in the diet. The definitions that are being used are discrete beverage categories, so that has been described to us as doing something on purpose, right? So these definitions are in your binder, they're on the website, so I'm not going to read those, but they include milk, 100% fruit juice, coffee, tea, diet beverages. So diet beverages, this is where that rack definition comes into play. So a diet beverage contains 40 calories or less per rack. So sweetened beverages, on the other hand, contain more than 40 calories per rack and include things like soft drinks, fruit drinks, and sports and energy drinks. Water in any type, tapped, bottled, carbonated, enhanced, as long as it has less than 5 kcals per rack, it is considered by definition to be water. And then alcoholic beverages inclusive of beer, wine, liquor, etc. In terms of dietary patterns, as I mentioned, we'll have the average HEI scores, we'll have the distribution of HEI scores, we'll be able to look at the population average change in scores between 2003 and 4 and 2015-16, and the food category sources that contribute to total energy intakes. For beverages for 2 and older, we have the percent who consumed, we have data on sweetened beverage consumption, mean daily beverage intake, and the percent mean energy of selected nutrients. So the federal data analysis team has prepared data already, specifically on carbohydrates, added sugars, protein, vitamin C and D, calcium, potassium, magnesium, phosphorus, and caffeine. And once we identify the nutrients of public health concern, we will also add those to this list. And then finally, the percent of daily beverage calories consumed by those discrete types. And I think this is our last question. The question is, how does dietary intake, particularly dietary patterns, track across life stages from the introduction of foods into childhood through older adulthood? And it should be noted that because we have the NHANES data to address this question, it's not longitudinal. So we don't have information on the same people and how their individual patterns change over time. We can just look at life stages in certain years. So that's a little bit of a limitation to specifically address this question. The introduction of foods is defined here. Any foods that are complementary foods and beverages other than human milk or infant formula. On this slide, we have the analytical framework. So we'll look at differences in food category sources of nutrients across the different life stages, differences in mean food group intake. So for 2 and older, the percent of each age group who meets the existing food recommendations, and then differences in beverage categories and how they contribute to energy and nutrient intakes across different life stages. Differences in food category contributions to energy intake across different life stages. So for infants and toddlers receiving human milk, energy intake will be limited to those complementary foods, not inclusive of human milk or infant formula, and for 2 and older, food category contributions to energy intake will also be assessed. We'll also be able to compare differences in HEI 2015 for those 2 and older. So you'll recall that before this committee's work, there were no dietary guidelines for beta 24, so we don't have a healthy eating index to compare them to at present. Here's the analytic plan, very similar to the things that I've mentioned before. We have the food category sources, we have population average intakes of food groups and food subgroups, the percent of the population that are meeting these recommendations, as well as daily energy and nutrient intakes from beverages across different life stages with the same nutrients listed here as on the previous slide. We also have the food category sources to energy across different life stages, as well as population average and component scores across life stages. So our next steps after we discuss these 5 protocols will be to really have some cross-cutting discussion with the B24 subgroup so that we are all aligned on how the data and food pattern modeling can best support the work of your committee. We'll have cross-cutting discussions with beverages and added sugars on the protocols specifically related to those topics. We'll draft protocols for the frequency of eating, of course in conjunction with that subgroup. And the plan is to have the information on nutrient intakes from dietary supplements this fall so that we can compare how foods and beverages relate to total intakes, and so how much is being contributed by dietary supplements to answer some of those questions. So our plan right now is to review the data analysis results and then draft conclusion statements. So here are the members again of the committee, as well as the support staff And special thanks to the federal family that are the data analysis team, who has already prepared a lot of data for us and will continue to develop the data as we are requesting them. So thank you very much. Questions? I know that was a lot. That was a lot for me, and I'm a talker, so.
So Reagan, one of the questions that you brought up are the age groupings, because those are certainly going to affect a lot of what the other committees are talking about. Many of the outcomes vary very dramatically between different age categories, and some of them require a much finer categorization of age than, let's say, NHANES. The DRI is much more specific than NHANES. So can you just elaborate a little bit more, or other members of the committee, on how you're thinking about that?
So some of the analysis has already been conducted, so we have some that does have larger age groups, sometimes 2 to 18, for example. We have the ability to request data on smaller subgroups, and there are a lot of federal reports that already exist with smaller subgroups. So I think we'll try to cobble together some of what we have and what we need to get at what you're talking about, but I think especially in terms of the beta 24 subgroup, the changes that occur in eating are so dynamic at that time that we'll have to probably have smaller age groupings than maybe even the DRI.
But even thinking about age 20 to age 60, so you're 65 and over, okay?
Yeah.
But there's a lot of difference there, too.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you're just going to end up with a hell of a lot of data and a lot of analyses, specific analyses, but I guess there's no other way to think about it.
Yeah, I think so, and I think that's something that we can put in our recommendations, that the federal government try to align in terms of life stages, but in terms of the work of the committee, I think we're kind of have our hands tied as to what's available and what we can request. Even the term older adult, is it 60, is it 65, is it 71 plus? Very hard question to grapple with.
It's older than me.
We won't comment on our specific ages, but yes.
It's like my definition I'm a pediatrician, my definition of a pediatric patient is anybody who's younger or shorter than I am.
Yeah. Well, even including 18-year-olds and 19-year-olds and using the term children is something that I think we all agree. A 2-year-old is very different than a 19-year-old. Although they both have a lot of emotional needs and issues. In terms of their nutrition, yes, both very different.
Yes, please. And just be sure and say your name for the transcriber.
Regan, I had two questions. One, in the analytic plan for adults 20 years and older, there's the examination of chronic liver disease outcomes, particularly, I was thinking the prevalence of high ALT and AST. So is that not available for populations under 20? I'm wondering why that's not an outcome for in the pediatric
Yeah,
population.
I don't think we considered it. It's certainly something that we can look into, and that's why we have these discussions, because we were thinking about fatty liver in terms of adults, but I think that's a very salient point, that if the data are available in children, we should examine those as well.
Yeah, no, I having seen even 8-year-olds with very high ALT and AST, I would recommend that we try, if the data is available,
Yeah, if it's
that we
available,
extend
we'll
that
certainly add that.
to populations under 20. And then the other question I had was about the data sources. So do we not have any data available from PEDNAS or WIC, the Supplemental Nutrition Program for Women, Infants, and Children? Because there's surveillance data that they have on prevalence of overweight and obesity among women and pregnant lactating women and infants under 5, I think.
Okay, we can look into that for sure. We've kind of thought mainly right now about the data that we've described to you, but there are other federal resources that can be utilized.
And my last question, sweetened beverages, are we including flavored milk in that definition? I see soft drinks, fruit drinks, and sports drinks, but I
I'm
just
going
want to
to
make sure
punt that one to Dr. Panucci, but I think that the way that the discrete beverage categories are currently consumed is that it's milk as the base, and that that is not part of the sweetened beverage category, but I would...
I'm just looking at the slide.
Oh, yeah, I
on
don't have the
page
slide in front of me.
19, And milk says plain and flavored milk, other milk, dairy drinks,
Okay.
and milk substitutes. Yes, please, Rachel.
Rachel Novotny. I am interested, this is perhaps a B24 question. I know you said you're going to work with them, but on the analytic plan for 1 and above, the usual intake distributions that exclude infants receiving human milk, I guess
It's not excluding the infants, it's excluding the data, the contributions from the infant formula or from human milk. So it's not excluding the children, it's just excluding those as a source of nutrients.
Yeah, I guess, so, but that effectively excludes them, correct? The infants who would be receiving human milk. I guess what I'm getting at is, I realize it's difficult to estimate the volume of human milk. You'd have to make an estimate, but I think the converse is that we end up with an assumption that the diet pattern of 1 to 1 and above excludes human milk.
Yeah, and I think that's something that we'll have to discuss as we develop the B24 protocol. This is just kind of a first pass at what we're thinking. I know that the databases that are available to analyze human breast milk it's an active area of investigation. And you know that the nutrient composition in terms of fat and nutrients changes quite dramatically. And so I think it's hard to capture that with real accuracy.
Right.
But I think that's something that the B24 group, that will need to come together with the data analysis working group to decide how to handle that specifically.
I would hope maybe we could find I think an estimate would be better than assuming that. Sorry, I'm thinking that an estimate might be a better norm to set.
Louder, we can't hear in the back at all.
And
Can't hear in the middle either.
okay.
You're whispering to yourselves. This is supposed to be a public meeting.
Okay, sorry. Okay. So my suggestion is that we see if we can find an estimate so that we can include a pattern of infants who are breastfed in the 1+ age group, and it not reflect only those who are not breastfed.
Yeah, and I just said that is an active discussion that the working group on data analysis and food pattern modeling would have with the B24 committee to figure out how we can best estimate nutrient intakes in this rapidly growing population. Changing, not growing. Well, they are growing too. We apologize for the microphones. We can hear each other up here, but we didn't realize that we couldn't hear you, so it wasn't intentional by any means.
Okay, so we have Rick, Mattis, and Sharon. Were you going to say something else? But Rick and then Sharon.
Rick Mattis. So I'm struck by the overlap or common goals for what you're describing in both the frequency of eating and the beverages and added sugars committees. And please take this as intended to be very constructive rather than. So
if we, in the end, I mean, your modeling is going to be based on the large surveys, the epidemiology and so on. The subcommittees, the other two subcommittees, will be looking at randomized controlled trials and so on. It won't surprise me that in the end, there is some disparity between the outcomes from those two sources of data. How are we going to deal with that? Are we going to say we came up with different answers based on the data set, or do we say there is a hierarchy of science here, and the stronger science, this is what we're going to base our recommendations on? If the latter, maybe there's so much redundancy here, we should be thinking about, do we really need to do the bazillion analyses you've got proposed there?
I think what you will identify in your systematic reviews will be complementary to what we're doing. We will identify, for example, added sugars. You might come to a consensus statement on a recommendation on added sugars, and then we would provide data on the prevalence of intake of sugar-sweetened beverages, for example. We wouldn't say that necessarily is trumps what you found. The data are what the data are, and that's this working group kind of just telling you, these are the facts, not ma'am, but mister. And so I don't think that it's a lot of overlap. You're identifying relationships with health outcomes, and we are providing information on where Americans are at relative to those recommendations. So I think it's kind of more of a dovetail than overlap. But I'd love to hear other people's opinions.
This is Carol Boucher. It's real short. I wanted to reinforce that because this really does help inform. We'll find out what might work well when we're looking at these randomized trials. But you'll give us the gauge as to where we can start from, either up or down.
Sharon Donovan. So I guess I just want to reiterate what Rachel and Elsie have said in terms of the B24 being a new charter, that if we don't consider, human milk and infant formula, and also the B24 committee is talking about some of these follow-on formulas that are actually fed to toddlers, and we anticipate, particularly like iron and other nutrient intakes, will be quite different compared to one-year-olds who move to cow's milk. So, whether it's trying to get access to other data sets, because otherwise we're not going to be able to make any sort of recommendations if we're just considering not many women, not a high percentage of women breastfeed for longer than a year, but it is recommended. So our committees can work on that, but I think that we really need to do the due diligence about collecting that data and discussing, because with DRIs, we use average intakes and average consumption to at least extrapolate requirements.
One thing that I would like to hear some discussion from the committee members, you presented a way of looking at the nutrients of public health concern. You had a diagram for that, looking at 3 components of nutrients of public health concern. And I'm interested in whether other committee members find that a useful approach for going forward, or had some questions or comments about how we might define nutrients of public health concern. It's on page 13 if you're looking at your slides.
So just a reminder, it's looking at those 3 prongs, 1 being dietary intakes, 2 being biochemical, and 3 being clinical health consequences. Are there any other ways that we can think about collectively to identify what are nutrients of public health concern?
Dr. Ard, you look like you're posed to say something.
He said, "I followed my lead."
Well, I take that to indicate support for the approach that you proposed, and so let me turn the question around. Does anyone see a problem with taking that approach?
Linda Van Horn. The only thing, I think, hearkening back to the discussion of the last round of the guidelines related to dietary cholesterol, there was a statement related to dietary cholesterol no longer being a nutrient of concern. And there was a tremendous amount of confusion in the public as to what that meant. Everything from, whoo-hoo, let's eat eggs, to maybe we should, rethink what the role of dietary cholesterol is. So my only point is that while I think the definition and the criteria are good, if for whatever reason this group should come up with another decision of that sort, I think we have to be very explicit as to what that means and why that was decided upon, so that we can establish, quite universally what is meant by that decision.
It sounds like you're making sure we recognize all three components, that it's not just one or the other, but all three components. Great, thank you. That's helpful. Pardon?
Linda, your comment made me realize the reality is every nutrient is of public health concern. So we really need to be careful when we actually label them that way and how we write this up, because we don't want anyone to think that there isn't any nutrient that isn't important.
Rick Mattis, so it specifically says nutrients of concern, but there are food constituents that are commonly consumed with health implications. Do we want to talk about phytochemicals and so on?
I think the reason that it is labeled a nutrient is because one of the, we need to have a DRI for it in order to compare it to a reference standard, and we need to have a validated biomarker. And so for a lot of the phytonutrients and things like that, while we recognize they exhibit a health effect, we don't necessarily have that type of data that are available to make the statement, is my thinking there.
Yes, please.
Lydia Bazzano, I just wanted to point out that the clinical health consequences there are really the most, I would say, those are the things that we have to weigh most heavily, because where we may not have data, where we do have data, that's what needs to weigh the most heavily, and I understand that there may not be data for everything.
I'm being reminded to encourage everyone to be sure you speak up, so it's amplified well. Other questions or comments about the presentation on the data analysis?
Rachel Novotny, I'll speak as loudly as I can. Just raising the question about the nutrients of public health concern makes me wonder whether, as we go forward, and not for now because I think we have our agenda, but whether we actually do want to think about foods or food groups or food patterning of public health concern in the future.
Joan Sabaté, that's also my concern. I think going back to this nutrient of intake, biological endpoints, or clinical health outcomes, if we do not have guidelines as far as some of the food constituencies, such as phytochemicals and so on and so forth, that means that we're just giving priority to some food constituencies called nutrients versus others that are not, because ultimately all of them come from food. So when we make in the hierarchy of making decisions, are we going to just based on the nutrients for which we have guidelines and not for the ones that we don't, even though they have influence on health? And finally, I mean, this committee is trying to define nutrients of intake, or is trying to guide the general public as far as what foods to consume and in what different proportions.
Rachel Bani, just to elaborate that again, I think also as we communicate with the public about these things, my feeling is that talking in nutrients has contributed to turning to supplements rather than food. So again, just to reiterate, I think as we look for language for these things, I think as a food-based group, the more we can talk in foods, the better.
So, Reagan, I know you pointed to the fact that when it comes to looking at data for dietary patterns, knowing what kind of pattern are you following, we're limited in terms of the type of data there. And it might help to amplify how this relates to the discussion that we're currently having.
Yeah, so right now what we're limited to is the healthy, sorry, Reagan Bailey. So to address that, we have data on the healthy eating index only. And the data that Dr. Panucci presented at the first meeting indicates that most Americans, or a high proportion of Americans, aren't doing that. We don't have data on what they are doing. And that is something that I think really needs to be addressed for, I don't think can be addressed for this committee, but certainly for future committees. We have to know the current dietary patterns that are being consumed, in addition to how they relate to the healthy eating index. So I think I really hear what you're saying, and I appreciate it. But at this current point, we're a little bit limited with the data that we do have available to us, unfortunately. Don't shoot the messenger.
Well, and that
Messenger's doing great.
Yeah. That may be the perfect introduction to our next subcommittee report. So thank you very much, Reagan. I think that was very helpful, and I appreciate the comments from the committee. It's been a tremendous amount of work. So our next subcommittee is to focus on dietary patterns, and Carol Boucher, the chair of that subcommittee, will give the report. Carol.
Thank you. So I was introduced as Carol Boucher. I can confirm that, I am. And I represent the Dietary Patterns Subcommittee. And they're good, there are the slides. And the other, you can see the other members of the subcommittee up on the slides also. Okay, am I hitting the wrong button?
The arrow.
I think you're holding it upside down.
Oh,
There you go.
I was holding it upside down. It does not work that way. So for the next people, remember that. The topic areas that this subcommittee was tasked with are listed on this slide. The first 6 have asterisks indicating that those will be presented today. as noted, we're the Dietary Patterns Subcommittee, so the key definition that we are using for dietary patterns in all the 2020 Advisory Committee reviews are the quantities, proportions, variety, or combination of different foods, drinks, and nutrients where available in diets and the frequency with which they are habitually consumed. This definition was applied to all analytical frameworks for the subcommittee, which will be presented shortly, and for the ones that are not yet done. And this is an aspirational definition that was developed by a panel of international experts for the existing NESR systematic reviews. And all information provided by studies about the dietary patterns tested or examined, including both foods and beverages, macro and micronutrients, will be extracted from included articles. So the two questions listed on this slide, what is the relationship between dietary patterns consumed and all-cause mortality, and what is the relationship between dietary patterns consumed and sarcopenia, will be answered by conducting original NESR systematic reviews. So these have never been done before. The 4 questions listed on this slide with outcomes of neurocognitive health, growth, size, body composition, and risk of overweight and obesity, cardiovascular disease, and type 2 diabetes will be answered by updating existing NESR systematic reviews. The analytical framework that was brought up earlier is shown on this slide and illustrates the systematic review question examining the relationship between dietary patterns and all-cause mortality. Do you think we ran out of batteries already?
Just wouldn't advance if you did that.
So it looks like the computer is shutting down, which is nice. So we'll just pause for 1 second and have IT come set it back up. So if you'll just hold so we don't continue the discussion without the visual. So 1 second.
It happened in a presidential debate. It's happening.
Right. I think I might, have things coming through me that are...
Don't take it personally.
No, I think that it's so excited about dietary patterns that it overheated.
It clearly didn't have breakfast.
Right. Gosh, and we're going to be already behind on 11 minutes. Okay. Pardon? Isn't that the truth? Amazing. I'm shocked by that. Yeah, hopefully we won't need that. Isn't it? Thank you so much. We'll get rocking and rolling here again. So I'm going to start at the beginning of this slide. So you'll have heard this sentence before, but just to make sure that we're on the same page. This is the analytical framework shown on this slide. It illustrates the systematic review question examining the relationship between dietary patterns consumed and all-cause mortality. The analytical framework provides a foundation for the systematic review and helps to inform the development of the inclusion and the exclusion criteria. The subcommittee defines all-cause mortality as the total number of deaths from all causes during a specific time period. This is the first analytical framework presented. The others that you've seen today have been purely demonstration frameworks. So for this presentation, we will add animation to point out all the parts and pieces of the analytical framework. The intervention or exposure of interest is consumption and/or adherence to a dietary pattern. The comparators are consumption of and/or adherence to a different dietary pattern and different levels of consumption and/or adherence to a dietary pattern. The outcome of interest in this particular case is all-cause total mortality. The population of interest for this particular case, intervention, exposure, and outcomes, the population is for interventions and outcomes are children through older adults who are healthy and are at risk for chronic disease. For the question, the subcommittee decided that infants and toddlers from birth to 24 months were out of the scope. Key confounders, which are factors that may impact the relationship of interest in this systematic review, are shown on this slide and include sex, age, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, physical activity, anthropometry, energy intake, and smoking. From this point forward, the analytical frameworks will look like this and not have animation. But they liked it so much, they did it twice. Okay, the next framework should be sarcopenia. It's coming. Yes, okay. The next topical area is sarcopenia. This is the systematic review framework examining dietary patterns consumed and sarcopenia. The subcommittee discussed and applied a definition of sarcopenia based on the review of the Foundation for the National Institutes of Health Biomarkers Consortium's Sarcopenia Project, as well as the consensus of 3 European working groups that converged to operationally define sarcopenia. The definitions those groups presented generally aligned on parameters of low skeletal muscle or lean mass, low strength or weakness, and/or low muscle performance. That is, mobility impairment, walking, speed, or function. Therefore, the definition for sarcopenia applied to this systematic review is progressive and generalized loss of skeletal muscle mass alone or in conjunction with either or both low muscle strength and low muscle performance. In this particular case, we have an intermediate outcomes which include low muscle mass, strength, and performance, and sarcopenia or severe sarcopenia as endpoint outcomes. The population of interest for the intervention exposure of dietary patterns includes adolescents, adults, and older adults who are healthy and are at risk for chronic disease. For this question, the subcommittee decided that infants and toddlers from birth to 24 months were out of scope. The population of interest for the outcomes of sarcopenia includes adults and older adults who are healthy and are at risk of chronic disease. The confounders are sex, age, socioeconomic status, anthropometry, total energy intake, dietary protein intake, physical activity, and physical disability. The next analytical framework is dietary patterns and neurocognitive health. The analytical framework here illustrates the question examining the relationship between dietary patterns consumed and neurocognitive health. The outcomes include developmental domains as specified on the right: academic performance, attention deficit, hyperactivity disorder, autism spectrum disorder, cognitive decline, and cognitive impairment and dementia, Alzheimer's disease, anxiety, and depression. The population of interest includes children through older adults who are healthy and are at risk for chronic disease. For this question, the subcommittee excluded infants and toddlers because the birth to 24 months subcommittee will be completing this review. The key confounders: sex, age, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, anthropometry, total energy intake, alcohol intake, smoking, physical activity, and family history of neurocognitive disorders. The next analytical framework focuses on dietary patterns consumed and growth, size, body composition, and risk of overweight and obesity. The outcomes include weight and various forms of weight, body BMI, body composition and distribution, percent fat mass, fat-free mass, and incidence and prevalence of underweight, failure to thrive, stunting, wasting, healthy weight, overweight, and obesity. The population of interest for the intervention, exposure, and outcomes include children through older adults who are healthy and are at risk for chronic disease. For this question, again, the committee excludes infants and toddlers, and the birth to 24 months subcommittee will be handling this. Key confounders are sex, age, total energy intake, physical activity, anthropometry at baseline, and smoking. Cardiovascular disease is shown on this slide. The analytical framework here illustrates the review of dietary patterns consumed and cardiovascular disease. The intermediate outcomes include total cholesterol, low-density lipoprotein, high-density lipoprotein, triglycerides, and blood pressure. The endpoint outcomes include cardiovascular disease and specifications listed, stroke, venous thrombosis, cardiovascular disease-related mortality. The population of interest here includes children through older adults who are healthy and are at risk for chronic disease. The confounders, the key confounders: sex, age, energy intake, physical activity, anthropometry, and smoking. The type 2 diabetes is that's the last analytical framework that we finished before this meeting. And this illustrates the systematic review for type 2 diabetes and dietary patterns consumed. The intermediate outcomes include hemoglobin A1C, glucose, insulin, and prediabetes. The endpoint outcome is type 2 diabetes. The population of interest for the intervention, exposure, and outcomes includes children through older adults who are healthy and are at risk for chronic disease. Key confounders as shown is sex, age, total energy intake, physical activity, anthropometry, and smoking. The inclusion and exclusion here, these criteria were outlined in Dr. Schneeman's presentation. And so we will apply all of the ones that she outlined clearly in her presentation. And then inclusion and exclusion criteria unique to the various analyses that we are doing are starting here. And so for the 2020 Advisory Committee systematic reviews examining dietary patterns consumed, we'll apply all of the inclusion-exclusion criteria here for the intervention exposure to operationalize the definition of dietary patterns presented in this presentation. And studies that examine, so these will be studies that examine consumption and/or adherence to dietary patterns, such as an example, the dietary approaches to stop hypertension, a vegetarian or vegan dietary pattern, a low carbohydrate dietary pattern, and high fat dietary pattern will be considered. They'll be measured or derived using a variety of approaches as specified in this inclusion criteria. Studies must describe the dietary pattern being tested or examined, at a minimum providing the foods and beverages consumed in the pattern for inclusion. Studies that examine low carbohydrate or high fat diets will be included as long as they meet the percent specified as, this is in the second row, as being the criteria which is less than 45% of energy from carbohydrate for low carb and or greater than 35% energy from fat, which is high fat. And these are based on the AMDR. And the exclusion criteria are studies that did not provide a description of the dietary pattern, or that they label the dietary pattern, but they do not describe the foods and beverages, or the base pattern is solely on nutrients. So this is a very food-oriented group. And studies that do not provide a description of the macronutrient proportion examined, or do not examine the percentages specified for low carbohydrate or high fat, if that is the pattern that's being suggested. And then there are corresponding inclusions for the active comparators. So for some specifics for each of the outcomes that we're going to be looking at, for all-cause mortality, it's studies that are reporting all-cause mortality, and then we'll exclude studies that report only one mortality or two, because we're looking at mortality from all causes. And then the inclusions for sarcopenia were covered on the sarcopenia slide. We don't have any exclusion criteria for the neurocognitive health or for the gross size or body composition, overweight, and obesity, and these inclusions were shown in the analytical framework slides. There are exclusions for CVD, and that's will exclude hypertensive disorders during pregnancy and or lactation. And for type 2 diabetes, we'll exclude gestational diabetes during pregnancy and or lactation, and type 1 diabetes. The dates of publications that we'll be using are, the reason they vary so much, so we have actually 3 different date ranges, has to do is if it's a new, if it's a brand new systematic review or an update of NESR. So the date range of the publication for the new systematic reviews will be January 2000 to May 2019. The date range of publications to update existing systematic reviews for the neurocognitive health outcomes will be August 2014 to July 2019, and this is in addition to the included articles published from 1980 to 2014, and an additional search will be done to capture outcomes that were not considered in the existing review, because the neurological health outcomes have had many changes in the labels, and we want to catch all those changes in the labels that have occurred in current times. The date range of the publication to update the systematic reviews for growth and size and body composition and CVD and type 2 diabetes will be August 2013 to July 2019, and this is in addition to the included articles from the previous systematic review of 1980 to 2014. So our next steps as we move forward, we will develop next the protocols for the questions of what is the relationship between dietary patterns consumed and certain types of cancer. And then the next question will be what is the relationship between dietary patterns consumed and bone health. Then in addition, what we'll be doing as our next steps is implementing the protocols for all of the questions that were just presented. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of them. So many thanks to the DGAC subcommittee members for enthusiastically participating in weekly meetings, and appropriately the support people are displayed in the bottom box. And the reason I say that's appropriate is because they represent the foundation of this enterprise. They are tireless in supporting all the activities of putting together these efforts and really are contributing to the success of the process. So this slide represents the end and being open for questions. Please.
Just Rick Mattis, one question. For the key confounders for the cardiovascular outcomes, did the committee consider sodium in there as something to contemplate? I know it's a can of worms, but.
No, we did talk about it. It's just it's so poorly measured. What are your thoughts? Do you think we should put it in?
I agree. Rarely is there an adequate measurement of it, but it does seem to be an issue that's very much on a lot of the population's mind, and we have an opportunity to evaluate the science and make a statement here. I don't know.
Yeah, so we have different, and the other thing, because it being hard to assess, it may not be present in the paper. So we could put it in the confounders that won't kill the paper. Yep. Yeah, okay. I'll make a note of that.
Yes, so that becomes a good measure of something where you want the data, you want to know if sodium has been a part of the study.
Yeah, good idea.
Other.
Tim Namey. Thanks for that nice presentation. So you listed, in terms of the patterns that we'd be considering, the DASH and vegetarian, vegan, low-carb, high-fat. Are there other patterns that are going to be included, or is that their list, or is that still up for discussion?
Those are EGs. Those are, it shouldn't be IE, they're EGs, they're examples. So really, the number of patterns available are very wide, and the most important conditions is that we can identify what the foods that comprise the pattern, and but it doesn't even have to have a name to make it in as a pattern. And we will take both theoretically derived patterns as well as hypothetically derived patterns. And I realized that was on the slide, but I didn't say it out loud.
Heather Leidy, two quick questions. One is a follow-up to that, and I know these are now examples, but I thought I'd just bring it back up. In terms of a low-carbohydrate diet, will there be ability to separate those out in terms of the other macronutrients, so there can be low-carb, high-fat, or low-carb, high-protein? So it sounds like all patterns are fair game, but I guess my point is, at the end of the day, will they be grouped according to certain dietary patterns that are listed, like low carbohydrate diets, and that might actually be very different depending on the macronutrient content. Do you understand what I'm saying? So there's a pattern that's low carbohydrate, but they're very different. There can be studies that define that, but then within that, they can have very different macronutrient compositions. And maybe a point to consider that some things maybe shouldn't be grouped in terms of a generalized pattern.
You know, that's an interesting point, because we really are looking at dietary patterns and they would all be together, but that doesn't rule out that we might not look at them in, by different types. And others here have been involved in this process before, and so I don't know when we start doing the analysis. Linda, I've been waiting for an opportunity to say that. You know this. So is that something that once we get to the analytical part that we can pull in parts and pieces and say, what happens if we take this one out? Or
Linda Van Horn. I'll let the other Linda speak for herself. But yes, I think this is definitely a topic that was discussed on some of our calls, including the sodium question, which of course is very much on the hot button list at the moment. But I think in some ways this is reminiscent of the discussion we just had earlier about nutrients of concern.
Yeah.
I think we're in an interesting point now in the fact that everyone recognizes that eating patterns are more descriptive of someone's totality of intake. But I don't think there's any way you can separate an eating pattern discussion from nutrients of concern. And I think what we're experiencing, even as we're speaking, is the fact that in many ways, the discussion about eating patterns really has to incorporate the concept, at least, of nutrients, especially macronutrients, but even micronutrients. I was thinking as you were speaking about carbohydrates, one of the nutrients of concern in this country is low fiber intake. You know, the U.S. public eats less than half of the recommended amount of dietary fiber, which we all know is derived in complex carbohydrates. So my only point is here, I don't think we can eliminate from our consideration as we think about dietary patterns the nutrient, macronutrient, or other distinguishing characteristic that really differentiates across these different eating patterns.
And I appreciate that completely. Where I'm coming from actually is we're creating now, we're putting together the structure for these reviews, right, these systematic reviews. And in order to not be biased then, we really would have to make these decisions a priori. That's why I'm asking the question, is that, you know, right now we're lumping these all together, but what you're saying, and I am really open to it, is then we a priori would need to somehow desegregate some of these to capture what you were talking about, and because that may be of importance. Because if we put them all in and do it afterwards, that's not following the rules. So that's why I was asking in the past, has this been done of desegregating these exposures that these studies that you have found that they met your criteria, but now you're going to split them again?
This is Heather, again, as a follow-up. I'm just thinking in terms of the Nesser search terms. It's hard to keep it broad because if you're not having, you know, if, for example, in this case, our discussion has been about everything but protein. So as an example, if you don't search by high-protein diets and you just go low-carbohydrate diet, there's an opportunity to actually miss some of those within the Nesser search criteria, and which is something I didn't think about. I guess maybe the search terms will come later on down the road, or I mean, we're already really establishing that. So there's examples that are listed, but I'm just not sure if that actually translates into all-encompassing search terms that will be able to pick up all these different dietary patterns.
And that's actually an interesting one to check on.
I think it might be worthwhile if the staff could perhaps come. I know you're sitting over there, but I can't see you. So, particularly this question on the search terms, I think it would be helpful.
Yeah, this is Laurel English. So to the first point earlier, I did just want to touch on the fact that we will extract all data that are reported to speak to your concern about the other nutrients. So if it's a low carbohydrate diet and they report the nutrients, the other macros, micros, we will extract all information that is reported by the article, and then we can group accordingly to your earlier point in the evidence synthesis with Mediterranean diets, low carbohydrate diet, et cetera. So we can do that and plan to do that. For the next question on the search terms, we do develop a comprehensive search strategy, and we use, there are mesh terms in the PubMed database, for example, ketogenic diet, low carbohydrate diet. We also add in keywords. So we have developed a comprehensive search, and it is peer reviewed by a second librarian. And then we also have test papers that confirm that our search is appropriate. So we believe it is comprehensive to that.
So we hope these are intentional.
Another real quick question. This is on, I don't think you need to go there, but on slide 15, it's the type 2 diabetes. And for me, just more of a clarification, the endpoint outcome is type 2 diabetes. And I wrestled with this in the frequency of eating, and so I thought I'd bring it up. I'm wondering what the outcome is. So when you look at the cardiovascular disease, there's parentheses with qualifiers in terms of what that endpoint is. With type 2 diabetes, I understand what type 2 diabetes is, but it's generally identified as a certain HbA1c, and HbA1c is actually an intermediate outcome. So I'm just wondering what the type 2 diabetes endpoint outcome will be, except that if somebody has type 2 diabetes, but is that the only criteria, or is it really based on somebody's HbA1c and the changes of that? It's a moot point, but it's an intermediate right now, and it seems odd that why it isn't in the endpoint outcome. And I'm not a medical doctor, but generally people are diagnosed with their HbA1c levels, and so that's why I'm just trying to figure out why that's not an endpoint instead of an intermediate.
Well, that's a good question. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. Jamie?
I mean, I would think it's both, actually, and I think when they're searching for the health outcome type 2 diabetes, but when looking at studies, they'll include studies that have HbA1cs that are below the threshold for type 2 diabetes, so one can follow that over time to a diagnosis of type 2 diabetes. I mean, I'd ask the staff, is that a correct interpretation? Yeah, I see heads bobbing. Yes.
Yeah, this is Laurel English again. And yeah, so to that point, it would be diagnosed type 2 diabetes. So if they were looking at dietary patterns consumed in those who were diagnosed with diabetes versus those who did not, that's really to get at that. But to your point, hemoglobin A1c, the other intermediate outcomes, we would be extracting in the data that are reported for those continuous measures or the particular levels. So it would be included pretty much as Dr. Kleiman mentioned.
So Dr. Ard? I think we had Dr. Ard and then Dr. Donovan.
So I was just going to Jamie Ard. I was going to follow up on Heather's question and point and the answer that Laurel gave around the macronutrient distributions and the dietary patterns associated with that. I think it will be important for us to think about the categorization of those specific types of dietary patterns because, as we've said, there's a wide range of what people define as lower carbohydrate or lower fat. And sometimes I think it's probably just as important to understand what was reduced in the dietary intake as well as what replaced it. So in thinking about a lower carbohydrate intake, I want to also know well, what replaced the carbohydrate? Was that replaced by fat intake, or was that replaced by protein intake? And maybe even further, you could see a branching of, well, was that protein mostly vegetable protein or animal protein? Was that fat mostly saturated fat or unsaturated fat? So I think it will be important for us in describing the results to, as best we can, clarify what we mean when we say this is the particular macronutrient dietary pattern, so that we do avoid this sort of general lumping of, well, it's just this, as we wouldn't necessarily say, well, all vegetarian patterns are the same, because there are different forms of vegetarian patterns, and we would be specific to describe, well, this is vegan, or this is lacto-ovo, et cetera. So I think that will be important for us to at least have a general working framework of how we might want to categorize that, and then put the studies in those relevant boxes to some extent. And it may not be at the level of, well, this has to be less than 20% carbohydrate, or this has to be less than 100 grams per day of carbohydrate, or to that extent, but at least some general framework of understanding not just what the reduced macronutrient was, but what replaced it.
Yeah. Yeah, and we've been...
I just wanted to piggyback on that just a bit. I think too, and we've discussed in our committee, the idea that the Mediterranean diet has many different variations. And so this probably will be true of all of the types of dietary patterns that we're looking at. Just wanted to add that.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. But Jamie, I really appreciate what you said, because we've been really sensitive to the complexity of this, and I'm glad that this came up, so that really gives us additional guidance in moving forward. I think we'll be able to find all the papers, but it will be really somehow harmonizing them across the spectrum in some way that makes sense with regard to, really what's available now is far more than what we had previously, I do believe.
So Sharon Donovan, this is more of just a general comment, and because I noticed that your publication dates, one is May, one is June, one is July, and it seems to me as a committee we should decide what is the latest date that we want all the systematic reviews to go to. We've talked about this because there's a bunch of new from the pregnancy B24 that were just published, but they only went to January of 2017. So while I understand we'll be rolling these, it seems like we should be consistent, or unless we can really justify why one should be May, one should be June, and one should be July.
Right, and actually I have a feeling that when you're looking at the date, that's the furthest out date, the closest to now, the intent is to gather whatever is currently available, and perhaps the staff could comment on that. So May or June, I don't think there was an intent to make a difference there. It was probably when the protocol went into the box.
Yeah, this is Laurel again. Yeah, that's correct. And we wanted to get started as soon as possible after those two first the new questions were approved and those protocols were approved. We did also develop the search strategy and shared the search strategy, and then conducted the search so that the staff could get going on literature search and screening. So,
but we will be consistent in terms of we're trying to gather the most current data.
yes, and if there was anything published after May, between May and July, for instance, we could do a secondary search to make sure that there were no additional publications that were missed between that time period.
So is that something we should adopt across the board then? Because I'm sure that's happening in every committee, subcommittee.
Oh, absolutely.
Right,
yeah,
right.
Absolutely.
Okay, We have one more report before we take a break at 11:45 for lunch. And, oh, I'm sorry.
No, it's better to.
Rick Massey, I'm thinking about this issue of the patterning and macronutrients and so on a little further, and just in case it helps your thinking as you go forward, you could couch it in different ways. You could talk about absolute level of each of those nutrients. You could talk about proportion of energy contributed by each of those nutrients. You could talk about the amount relative to recommendations of each of those nutrients. And I don't know what the right answer to that, but they could well give you different answers. And so you may want to think that through to make your decision.
Thank you.
So Dr. Sabate had a comment as well.
Joan Sabate, I have two comments to make. One is in line of what it was discussed before as far as what replaces carbohydrates, so foods that are coming from mainly carbohydrates. And again, since this is mainly a committee that has to deal with foods, I think besides whether it's protein or fat that is replacing, I think we at least have to capture, if the foods that are high in protein and fats are coming from vegetables or from animal intake. Because, there are, from the food viewpoint, there are two ways, to accomplish a low carbohydrate diet. The second point relates to a slide that is number 13, that we discussed that because I'm a member of this committee, in which we relate the dietary patterns with anthropometrics, particularly overweight and obesity. And total energy intake is listed as a key confounder. I think listing as a key confounder may decrease the ability to connect, dietary patterns and overweight and obesity. I think before trying to use as a key confounder, we have to analyze as a mediator, because some of the dietary patterns may relate to the overweight and obesity, mediating through the total energy intake, especially when we do in descriptive epidemiology and how people, consume these dietary patterns. So I think that besides using as a key confounder, it has to be studied as a mediator between dietary patterns and anthropometrics, because it could be that the connection is mainly through total dietary intake.
Tim Namey. I wanted to, in terms of consistency, you were controlled for smoking as a confounder for all these, and you controlled for alcohol consumption for the neurocognitive health, but not for overweight and obesity and cardiovascular disease and diabetes. And so I thought you should probably be consistent one way or the other. But I think it's an important potential source of calories and other possible effects. So.
That's a good suggestion. It's in all of them.
All right, and so eager for lunch. I jumped to this last one. So we are now at the third presentation, and we will take a break for lunch at 11:45, so we have plenty of time. And Dr. Heather Leidy is going to present for the frequency of eating subcommittee.
Yeah, I'm going to try to use my slides.
So Heather, you have to really work at making sure you're heard, okay?
Okay, sorry about that. We have really short mics. And so I'm short, but not that short, so I'll just...
panelists.
Yes. I'm sorry if you couldn't hear my comments earlier. I usually have a big mouth. So I will be presenting on behalf of Steve Heimfeld, who isn't able to be here today. He is the chair of this committee. And then also wanted to acknowledge Carol Boucher and then Rick Mattis, as well as Ron Kleiman, who were part of this committee as well. And so it was pretty exciting to be a part of this subcommittee. These are new areas of questioning that we were able to tackle, and you'll quickly find we spent a substantial amount of time in the earlier weeks defining the topic and working out the framework on the front end. And so as we go through the slides, if you have clarifying questions, feel free to ask, and the rest of the committee are happy to chime in with you all too. I'm going to try to add some rationale behind some of the things that we've selected, because they may seem a little, not off, but just different, and so I'll try to add some context to that. And so our topic areas that we had were the frequency of eating, and as you can see, the remainder, and Carol had already addressed these with the previous topic, but just so everybody's on the same page, you're really looking at eating frequency and all-cause mortality, growth, size, body composition, overweight and obesity, gestational weight gain, postpartum weight loss, cardiovascular disease, and type 2 diabetes. And we are covering all of the protocols today, and that's why they're in an asterisk. And so we really wanted to start with identifying the key definitions. And so if you have questions, feel free to raise them now, because that'll help drive some of the rest of the conversation. And so eating frequency, we defined in two manners. One is the number of daily eating occasions, and then the second one is the timing of daily eating occasions. And underneath that, then we had the timing of weekly eating occasions, really identifying weekday versus weekend, meal skipping, and then also fasting from a time-restricted eating paradigm. And so obviously now we have other things to define. And so an eating occasion is any ingestive event. And thinking in terms of what we know from the lay audience in the U.S. American diet, as well as how studies are designed, that includes preloads. So that is really anything before another eating occasion. So preloads, meals and snacks. Within this eating occasion, that includes all foods and or beverages, and then also whether they're caloric or non-caloric. Fasting was defined as an absence of an eating event greater than 8 hours during a waking period in a 24-hour period. Again, we're really trying to be sensitive to some of the more recent research with time-restricted eating or intermittent fasting, those types of concepts. And so time-restricted eating were really set patterns of eating occasions throughout the day. And so that's how that was defined. And then lastly, meals were dependent on timing throughout the day. So we're really trying to get at, what you typically see as a, breakfast, lunch, dinner / supper. And that's really around the morning, midday, and evening eating occasions. Not that it's an elephant in the room, but obviously snacking is another component. Due to the fact that there really is no standard definition for snacks, we felt the need not to include that as a definition because it's just very variable. I mean, some base it on timing or energy or caloric intake, and so we felt that because there's just no standardization, those eating occasions will be included as eating occasions, but we just felt that we shouldn't really define that, define snacks. The next piece then is, well, what eating, frequency of eating is not, because that really came in the discussion. And so 2 points here. The first is that we are not addressing the frequency of intake of single foods, beverages, or categories of foods or beverages. This is really about when to eat, not what to eat. But even in a call yesterday or the day before, it came up that there will be times that we can address other components, nutrients, macronutrient content, whatever, but the primary question within a study has to be the frequency of eating, and then within that we can then look at different types of the foods that were included within that. But this is not really specifically looking at single foods, like the frequency of milk consumption or frequency of seafood consumption, something like that. And then the second point are studies that do not have eating occasions across the day. And this really came about from this idea of meal skipping and breakfast skipping or dinner, or whatever is in the research right now. But you'll find that a lot of studies don't address subsequent eating throughout the day, that it is generally maybe if it's breakfast skipping, they assess lunch and that's it. And we really wanted to encompass with these outcomes that I'll share here in a minute, that these studies really need to have eating occasions across the entire day. To increase the quality of the study or to really adequately answer the question. And so those are the 2 points to keep in mind. Yeah, for sure.
So it's Jamie. So can you help me sort of figure or talk through what's the difference between meal skipping and time-restricted eating as you're conceptualizing it? If you're saying time-restricted eating is a set pattern of eating occasions, and I skip breakfast every day, which one is that? Is it meal skipping, or is that just I don't start eating until noon?
Sure, and feel free, the rest of the committee, to chime in, but that really is encompassing both of those aspects, because there are studies that just focus on breakfast skipping, which isn't really time-restricted eating, but that some time-restricted eating components have a breakfast skipping component, or maybe they also have breakfast and lunch skipping. So I think what we're trying to do is really include that all together. So it's, it depends on how the Nestor folks, or how we compile the findings at the end, but they can be separate, but they can also be combined depending on the study design.
Yeah, I think the goal here was to come up with terms that would be captured in a literature search, and it may actually be very similar, but to make sure we captured all the papers, we used both terms.
Anybody else?
I think also I think also we talked on the last call about intermittent fasting for, let's say, a religious reason or some other purpose. And as long as that's not the sole purpose of that study, then we would capture those. So if, for example, someone has a usual consistent eating pattern, but fasts periodically throughout the year, those will be captured. But if they're fasting for 4 days, that's not the kind of study that we'll capture.
Yeah,
right?
and again, we really had the mindset on the front end is, intermittent fasting has changed to the definition of time-restricted eating, but there are still a number of studies that have never been examined looking at that every other day. And so, when we look at that, we'll be able to capture that. But to your point, it's not a prolonged fasting period that we're trying to capture.
Rachel Novotny. I'm wondering about water, and especially with the frequency of consuming water throughout the day. I mean, we may not find a lot of studies on that, but just what are your thoughts for handling water?
Yeah, so we have that included in our definition that it's any eating occasion, caloric or non-caloric. So even those that are water and non-caloric will be included in the analyses, although as we all know, it's very difficult. Many studies don't actually assess water intake unless that's the only thing that they're changing. But that would be included in that would be captured in the search terms in terms of, because we're searching for any eating or drinking occasion, and that would be included.
So fasting with water is not fasting in your definition. It's drinking water.
In our definition, it would not be considered fasting because that would be an ingestive event. But we also have the caloric and non-caloric component to that. That in agreement? Okay. In terms of the inclusion-exclusion criteria, these were the standard Nestor criteria used, so I won't go over this slide, and we'll get to some of the things that are a little bit different in this with these research questions, so I'll just go ahead and move on. And so, again, this is the analytical framework. It's nice we've only had one of these so far, but in the afternoon we're going to see quite a few, I would imagine. The first part is the intervention and exposure, which is really the definitions that I just touched on. So I'm going to kind of go past that because the inclusion-exclusion criteria are there. In terms of the age of the study participants, you can see here that it's children to older adults, and we are not focusing on infants under the age of 2, and that's in our infants and toddlers, and so that's in the excluded criteria. And then in terms of the data publication, the committee also felt that going from January 2000 to the present was also appropriate. But we did this for 2 specific reasons, and we thought long and hard about this. The first one is that the methodology that we have is quite different now than it was 50 years ago in terms of some of the outcomes and the methods of capturing eating frequency. And so we felt to be consistent, 2000 and beyond would be the best consistent data with that. And then the second piece too is, it's interesting, much like probably dietary patterns, but eating frequency has a tendency to go through waves of research. And so I remember I went back and looked last night to make sure, some of the first big studies that came out were like in the 1950s. And there were a cohort that came out and then you didn't see it again until the 70s and then the 90s. And so the challenge that we found is, this is the first time we've asked these research questions. And so it'd be nice to go back and look at the totality of the data. The problem is as we know, eating patterns and eating frequency has changed over the past 50 years, whereas, 50 years ago, 3 meals was a staple with very little snacking. And so the control group there would be far different than the control group from like 2000s on, where there's a lot of meal skipping now and more eating occasions. And so that's why we felt it best to go from 2000 to the present, because that's the most consistency that we have with dietary patterns, and our control comparators would be more consistent with that. So that's why we chose to go with 2000 and beyond. In terms of the health status of the study participants, again, the Nestor standard criteria were included, although, this is more of an interesting thing, based on looking at the other presentations. I think they were the only ones that included this, but we actually excluded subjects who had post-bariatric surgery. And our thinking on this was, when individuals go through post-bariatric surgery, they would be healthy, maybe overweight or still obese, but you'd have a cohort of healthy individuals, so they should theoretically be included. But as you know, with post-bariatric surgery, they are recommended or prescribed smaller meals with more increased eating frequency, and we felt that wasn't generalizable to the rest of the population, and so we chose to include those in our exclusion criteria for that reason. Seems a little weird that we just added that on, but it really is because they changed their eating patterns. In terms of dietary data collection, this is also something I think that's unique to our committee. We wanted to have the highest quality data that we could capture, given that this is the first time this question has been asked. And so I feel like this is probably a little bit stricter than what you would think, but we chose a minimum of 3 days of dietary data collection on at least 2 occasions. And the intent of that was really to capture habitual eating frequency or eating habits, that it wasn't just a single day. And the other thing too with eating frequency, as an example with meal skipping, a lot of times you'll see that there's one eating occasion and then the data in these studies are only captured at that next eating occasion. And so you don't get the rest of the entire day, and it's really difficult to make recommendations when you're not capturing over a 24-hour period as well as over the days to look at habitual intake. And so that's why we chose the 3 days of dietary data. But as a note, because a question that came up is the food frequency questionnaires, because they're done one time. But if a lot of the ones that are validated are over the last week or months or years. And so the food frequency questionnaires would be included within this data. This would be acceptable because they are capturing over a 3-day period. But we do want, with the food frequency questionnaires, there would be 2 separate time points for those to be included. Does that make sense so far? And then in terms of the size of the group, we chose 15 participants for studies using a within subject analyses, and then 30 participants for studies using a between subject analyses, or at least including a power calculation. And it wasn't and, it's or. And so if a group or research publication has less than those, but have a power calculation that adequately is powered based on a lower sample size, we felt that was appropriate. Again, our intent is really to increase the quality and to have enough power within a study to detect the differences in the outcomes that they are proposing. Okay, so now we can get into the actual questions, and all of these questions that we're using the Nestor systematic review to answer those questions. So the first one is, what is the relationship between frequency of eating and all-cause mortality? And what we've done here is that you'll see very similar framework. Some of the ones that are in black in terms of the key confounders, potential confounders, and potential covariates are consistently used with other subcommittees, and then some of the ones are specifically for us, and then as we go along with each of the research questions, if something is changed, they're highlighted in red. So we'll kind of just work through that through this now. And so the top piece, we've already covered the intervention exposure versus the comparator, and the population is included there. In terms of the key confounders, again, we have sex, age, race, ethnicity. Total energy intake is in italics, which is really difficult to see, so I'm going to address that now. And so this was an interesting one that came up, and it's also to your point, Dr. Sabat. Total energy intake is actually, if you look at that, it's a key confounder, but it's also a potential covariate, because we're trying to see whether it's a confounder or a mediator. And so we felt that it was appropriate for these research questions with frequency of eating to include it both ways. And so the only way that a study would be dinged is if they're not using it in one or the other manner. And so that's why we went with it from that aspect. We did include habitual eating frequency, which I think is probably unique to our research questions. And again, there's a lot of studies out there that will do eating frequency studies, but baseline assessments are not included. And we felt that it was critical to know what somebody is habitually following from an eating pattern, to know whether it's the change in their habitual eating patterns versus just the eating pattern itself. And so that's why we wanted to include that as a key confounder. And then we have smoking, anthropometrics, and then menopausal status. In terms of the potential confounders, we are, I believe, the only group that has socioeconomic status as a potential confounder, not a key confounder. And just given the research question, we felt that we did not want that in the risk of bias as a key confounder. So it is included, but it's included as a potential confounder. We also have physical activity, cultural practices, eating environment. So in essence, who you eat with, where it is, whether it's work, school, or around an exercise schedule. Thinking in terms of holiday eating or seasonal eating. Sleep schedules, trying to get at shift work, dentition, hydration status, pregnancy status, and pubertal status. And so all of these potential key confounders we felt were important for the frequency of eating, but not served as a key confounder. And then lastly, the potential covariates would be related to different aspects of energy. And so we have diet energy density, as well as the energy state of the diet. So we were, in terms of energy, we were trying to think of it two ways, one with the diet and one from a physiological energy. And so the first part we wanted to use as a covariate is, as I said, the energy balance. So total energy intake, let me go back. Energy state of the diet, so whether it's an energy restriction diet or an energy surplus or an overfeed study, but then as well as thinking in terms of energy from an energy balance, whether somebody's in an energy restricted state or an energy surplus state, thinking in energy intake and energy expenditure. And then we also included portion size, macronutrient content, location of eating occasion, habitual eating frequency, and biochemical changes. And again, you'll see, some of these are listed both ways. So as a key confounder, as well as a potential covariate to see whether they are truly a confounder versus a mediator. And so that's why we have it as such. And I don't think we've actually defined all-cause mortality, but that is the total number of deaths from all causes during a specific time period. The next question that we had is, what is the relationship between the frequency of eating and growth, size, body composition, and risk of overweight and obesity? And I'll only highlight the changes that we have within this versus the others. And so if you look at, obviously the endpoint outcomes were very similar to what Dr. Boucher had presented with the dietary patterns. So I'm not going to go into that because they are identical. Our key confounders here, the only thing that we added as a key confounder was physical activity, and that's really driven by when you're thinking in terms of some of these outcomes related to obesity, a lot of these studies that have eating frequency also have a physical activity or exercise component, and so we felt that even if they didn't have an exercise component for this type of, these types of outcomes, it was critical to have an assessment of their physical activity or energy expenditure status. And so that's why that is a key confounder. Potential confounders, same as the previous one, although we did add medication and substance use, and this is related to any types of substances or medications that would affect body composition or obesity status, those aspects. So we felt it was important for this question to include those. And then the potential covariates, the only thing that we added was a specialized diet, including all liquids diets. There are studies that look at eating frequency and have diets that are just all beverages, and so we felt that was important because it's not very representative of the population of who are consuming those. Whoops. The next question that we had is, what is the relationship between frequency of eating during pregnancy and gestational weight gain? Whoops, sorry about that. There we go. So it's pregnancy and gestational weight gain. In terms of our intervention exposure versus comparator, the population was changed obviously to women during pregnancy. Gestational weight gain, I think this might be, I don't know if I guess we haven't heard it at this point. So it's change in maternal body weight from baseline before during pregnancy to a later time point during pregnancy and or right before delivery, as well as weight gain in relationship to weight gain recommendations based on pre-pregnancy BMI. And as I said, the population is women during pregnancy. The key confounders here, we did add pre-pregnancy anthropometrics within that. The potential confounders, very similar to previous, except we added the history of gestational diabetes, the history of gestational hypertension. And just to make sure we're defining gestational weight gain, that's a weight a woman gains during pregnancy, and no changes to our potential covariates within this model. The next one is, what is the relationship between the frequency of eating during lactation and postpartum weight loss? Within this is women during lactation is the population. And just as a side note is that women who are not lactating would not be included within this. They were really just focusing on women during lactation. Postpartum, the endpoint is changes in weight from baseline, postpartum to a later time point during the postpartum period, and postpartum weight retention if gestational weight gain is controlled for. We're defining postpartum weight retention as the amount of weight that remains during the postpartum period minus the woman's pre-pregnancy weight. And we've added some key confounders, a little bit different than the previous ones, and that being pre-pregnancy anthropometrics and gestational weight gain. But no differences in potential confounders. And given a potential covariate, we included the lactation duration, thinking that that is a critical point in terms of how long an individual or woman has been lactating. The next question is, what is the relationship between the frequency of eating and cardiovascular disease? And within this model, we have same things on the intervention exposure versus the comparator. In terms of the endpoint outcomes, we have cardiovascular disease, and you can see those that are listed within that, as well as stroke, venous thrombosis, cardiovascular disease-related mortality. And then we also have the intermediate outcomes listed here, which is very similar to the other subcommittees that have used that. Key confounders and potential confounders were similar to the previous ones. In terms of potential covariates, those that are highlighted in red were ones that we added for this specific outcome of these outcomes of interest, and that being dietary sodium and potassium, as well as dietary fat composition. And then the last research question is what is the relationship between the frequency of eating and the risk of type 2 diabetes? Again, very similar as what were previously discussed. Endpoint is type 2 diabetes, and we can see that our intermediate outcomes here again are glucose, insulin, hemoglobin A1C, and prediabetes. Our key confounders, potential confounders, and potential covariates are the same as the ones that are used previously, so I'm not going to list all those. I'm quickly realizing, though, with our group, we have a lot more of these than the dietary patterns, so I'm not sure if we're maybe being more specific or all-encompassing. I'm not sure how that works, but we do have quite a bit that we're targeting. The nice part is these don't eliminate studies in terms of the potential covariates or potential confounders. It's just something that we're trying to keep an eye on as we go forward. And I think this is probably driven by the fact that this is the first time these questions are being asked. In terms of next steps, we will begin screening search results, extract data, and conduct risk of bias assessments, prepare the evidence, synthesis, develop graded conclusion statements, and then document limitations and research recommendations. And so with that, just wanted to acknowledge the members and the support staff. It's been a really great opportunity working within this group, and especially the support staff have been overly helpful. When questions get raised, it's great that they come back with examples and things for us to consider. And so it's been a great opportunity. So with that, I'll field any more questions if you all have them.
Thanks, that was great. The only thing I would add on the frequency of eating and postpartum weight loss, you have lactation duration, but you might also want to consider exclusivity. So if a woman is exclusively breastfeeding versus mixed feeding, so if that's reported.
I actually got thinking about this, Rachel Novotny, whether you might want to include monthly in frequency of eating. I mean, it would need further elaboration. What I'm thinking about is lower income who change their eating patterns at the end of the month and eat less, start skipping meals. I'm not quite sure how you'd get at that, but it would be, you would probably want socioeconomic status or food security status with that question.
No, that's a really good point. And, the same was true with some of our terms that we were still, as of yesterday, still discussing back and forth. We have it within a 24-hour period, but in essence, if you're doing intermittent fasting and it's every other day, it actually needs to be extended to about 48 hours, or if it's across the week. So we're not limiting studies based on that. We're just trying to capture eating patterns, and if it's longer than, I think our minimum would be a 24-hour period, but it would be great if we could extend that. And that, you're exactly right. I mean, eating patterns across a month given SES status would be critical if those studies exist and if they actually have that.
Elsie Tavares. Heather, I wonder if, I saw sleep schedule, but I wonder if sleep duration should also be included in frequency of eating and body composition, gestational weight gain, and postpartum weight loss. Duration as opposed to just schedule, right? Because you're thinking of, I'm thinking of duration separate from maybe circadian misaligned eating. So that was one suggestion. And then I also wondered, I didn't see any mention as key confounders or potential confounders of screen use. So frequency of eating, especially if that eating is in front of a screen and exposed to advertising. I just wondered if the committee thought of how screens, television viewing, played into any of these relationships.
To answer your point about the sleep, I think that's a critical component. We put that in thinking of shift workers, but then, especially with breakfast skipping, there is some correlational data that suggests that that's related to sleep, or the sleep duration or the quality of sleep is potentially driving some of the meal responses. And so something for us to think about to include. In terms of the screen use, we didn't, to my recollection, we didn't include that specifically, but we did talk about where or when or who the eating occasion is with. So if it is at home or versus out at a restaurant or something like that, that's included. But just because they're eating at home doesn't mean that they're eating as a family unit or that they don't have something else in terms of screen time. So I think that's something that we should probably think about capturing. We do have some components of that, but not a specific statement about screen time. That's a really good point.
Sharon Donovan, and I guess the comment about end of the month, it also made me think that you have habitual eating patterns for both pregnancy and lactation. And I think that women change their eating behaviors and frequency during these periods of time. So I think it's okay to look at, within these time periods, differences in eating frequency, but I'm not sure you want habitual in as a key confounder.
I think our intent was to capture, and feel free to chime in, but it was to capture what they were habitually consuming before. So this would be pre-pregnancy. So it depends on what we're qualifying as baseline. But if they became pregnant, their eating frequency may change, and then postpartum it may change as well. And so we were trying to figure out just to capture that habitual period of time, because if their eating patterns are most likely changing, but nobody really has quantified how they're changing. And so that's why we felt that it was important, again, not that it's going to exclude a study, but that the quality of the study will be evaluated a bit differently if they've captured that versus if they haven't. Rick, I don't know if you want to comment.
This is Reagan Bailey, short mic here too. My question was surrounding the diet assessment. I'm not sure that most of the food frequency questionnaires capture that rich contextual detail of timing and screens and with whom you're eating the way that a 24-hour recall can. So are there any validated questionnaires that assess purposeful versus non-purposeful skipping of meals or time-restricted feeding that could be considered?
There are.
Okay.
But that's a good point. Again, we're thinking in terms of, I think we went in thinking highest or best quality of research and so, or data, and so thinking, 3-day dietary recalls would capture that more effectively than food frequency questionnaires. They're still included, but the rating may be a little less. But there are questionnaires that we've actually used them that look at screen time and different components of that. So I think, food frequency questionnaires can also capture time, duration. They're just different questions. So maybe we just need to think about whether, right now we just have food frequency questionnaires included, but you're suggesting that we, maybe call them something a little bit different. If it's an eating occasion questionnaire or something like that. I know breakfast skipping questionnaires. I guess we would need to define what a food frequency questionnaire is.
Yeah,
and so we have that generally, but it's what we think, I think as nutritionists or dietitians, food frequency questionnaire might be different than some of these other ones, and they're just eating questionnaires. And so I think maybe we need to include that as well.
Okay, thanks for that clarity. The way that I understood it originally was that a food frequency questionnaire would be better than the recalls at getting at habitual intake. So that really is helpful.
I'm sorry, yeah. The reason I brought that up is because our first thought is, well, they wouldn't be included because it's not 3 days. And then it's, well, no, food frequency questionnaires, the ones that are generally validated are longer term. But, I think if we're rating them, most of us, the reason we included the 3-day minimum was thinking of dietary recall assessments as the first, but that we didn't want to exclude any studies that have food frequency questionnaires because some of them do get at eating occasions.
Okay.
And so, yeah, that's the tier that we were thinking of.
Great. And then just to follow up on that same slide, so a study that has fewer than 15 people, but a power calculation that they are adequately powered would be included?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Joan Sabaté. I just would like a clarification on the number of daily eating occasions, because this is the exposure for most of the outcomes that you are relating to. And I put that as an example, based on your definitions. If somebody has a caloric intake of 1, 2, or 3 times a day, plus drinks water 7 times a day, is a total number of eating occasions of 10. Will this number of 10 will be different than somebody that has just 10 small meals, caloric meals a day? And will both be the same number and will be related to the outcomes by this numerical way?
Go ahead.
Yeah, we actually thought about that some. So eating frequency can affect total energy intake multiple ways. One is energy actually contributed by the eating event. The other is by just changing the physiology, the behavior of the individual so that it alters subsequent intake. And so frequent consumption of water may actually have an impact on the energy value in food selected when there is an energy yielding consumption pattern event. So I think we want to count total ingested frequencies to be able to capture both of those ways frequency impacts intake.
But I think, so that's our search strategy. And then once the findings come in, I think we would comment on whether those eating occasions had calories or didn't, or even the food form or those aspects. So I don't think, much like the dietary patterns, I don't think we're going to once we see the studies in their totality, we may be able to pair some together, but if there are very specific differences like caloric content, then I think they need to be treated separately.
But I think this should be stated from the beginning, because one thing is to have the number of freaking occasions, and another one is to, besides having the number, to compute which ones contribute calories versus which ones do not contribute with calories, which is mainly water. Because it's a completely different approach.
So
especially in the context of intermittent fasting and things of this sort. I'm not saying that what you are saying is relevant, but it may get a confusion between the two approaches that I'm proposing.
So let me ask a question. Would it change your interpretation if the multiple ingestive events were primarily water versus a low-calorie beverage?
I think so, definitely so.
So you think water is a unique source of input? What we're trying to capture is something about frequency, not source of nutrients, energy, or whatever. It's a behavior of how often something is ingested.
I think this is an important question.
Yes,
I'm not saying that what
yes,
you're proposing is irrelevant, but I'm just saying that there is a big definition between a dietary pattern that includes 2 or 3 caloric eating frequencies, eating occasions, versus having 10 occasions in which they are caloric derived. And in the one that is 3 plus water, many people, is following, this is one pattern versus, I would say we have to separate the specific number, whether it brings calories into the frequent occasion or not, is very relevant.
Except that our fundamental research, the fundamental question of interest is really, and that's why I put it back up, is it's the number of eating occasions and the timing. The caloric content it's not answering that question. That's and what we've gone roundabout with that. It really is a separate question because we're really just seeing about timing, not so much the content within those. We will have that and we will be able to document that and look at macronutrient content or energy within each of those occasions, but that first global definition is really about when to eat, when or the number to eat versus the caloric content within those. That's a really good point, and we've talked about that, but I think we felt that was the truest definition of eating frequency was just based on number and timing.
Yeah, and water, we tend to think of it as essential but inert in some ways, and it really isn't. It alters gastric emptying, GI transit time. It may acutely influence appetitive sensations. It has real physiological implications too, and so I think it's artificial to draw a line with that kind of an event.
But that's a really good point, and that's something that we didn't use as a key confounder, in that there's a lot of studies that don't capture or quantify water, and there are others that do. So we need to probably go back and be sensitive of that, because there are a number of studies that will be ad libitum water consumption throughout the day, or that's not even stated in their strategy. And I don't think we actually have that as a key covariate, and we might want to think about putting that in, because those studies that focus on water will have it documented. Those that don't, and we're not listing that as something of a point of concern. So.
Linda Van Horn. Just an important point to this discussion relates to children. And we're probably all familiar with the fact that, appetite regulation in children is something that's of great interest to prevention of obesity. And the type as well as the amount of calories is important, evidently, especially for children whose, from the literature I've read, and I'm sure most of you have, their ability, when they're drinking a sugary beverage, for example, to regulate their caloric intake in subsequent meals is not the same as when they're consuming either water or some other type of food. But the sugar, liquid candy, so to speak, doesn't seem to have the same impact in terms of energy intake in subsequent meals that it does with other foods. So my only point is to recognize that children may have a different, response than adults. And it would be valuable to be able to separate that if the data exist.
Well, and it's an interesting point too, because Rick and I are both also on the beverage subcommittee. And so I think that question that'll be more specifically addressed there with beverages. Just a point that there's a lot of crosstalk with some of these. And I guess fortunately we're on both.
Yeah, and I was going to add that food patterns as well, so beverage food patterns and food frequency all have to integrate the information that's being analyzed. And so I think that gets to the points that you're making, Linda, and others have made. Lydia?
Hi, Lydia Pisano. I just wanted to ask about, so the difference between fasting and meal skipping is really the intentionality. So you're capturing that in the confounding or covariate somewhere?
Yeah, and again, that point was really just looking at our search terms and what you typically see. Fasting, not overnight fasting, it's fasting across the day, trying to target that intermittent fasting. And then there's this other concept of meal skipping, and I think Jamie brought that up. It's really, a lot of those can be synonymous, but we wanted to separate them basically for the search strategy.
Well, if there are no other, Tim.
Can I just follow up on Rachel's initial comment, because I think it was an interesting one about possibility of, say, a monthly cycle in eating frequency. We talked about SES as a covariate. What about something like food insecurity? Would that be better?
Talked about.
Yeah, I know. I was trying to think about how it would be modeled too, whether that would be, I think we're talking about a population, the population in which I think it is most relevant probably is a food insecure one. But whether we would want to in some way stratify by socioeconomic status too. So I guess I would be inclusive in the poll. So maybe include as possible confounders, but consider possibly using a covariate, one of them as a covariate, probably the food security.
I think we'd think of those as an effect modifier potentially, and so it would be a covariate, and I think it's a very good idea to include it. Yeah, Tim.
I just wanted to return to this theme one more time, this issue about mediators versus confounders, and this very important issue about whether we consider total energy intake as a mediator or a confounder or both. And my hope is that you present both. So you have, for example, total energy intake and anthropometry as mostly kind of pitched as confounders. And I understand that if you want to isolate out the effects of frequency, then that's appropriate. But I would say for the public, and I think this is where we should consider what the public is. If God forbid, I was interested in losing weight, I would want to know, does fasting help me lose weight? And then, to me, it would be a secondary question as to whether it's because of reduced overall caloric intake, because you have fewer eating occasions, or because of its impact on metabolism. So I think it would be nice to report both of those things, but to consider, like, what would the public find potentially most interesting? And then my other quick question was, again, to come back to alcohol. Is it part of total energy intake? And even if it is, you might want to control for patterning, which has, probably impacts on cardiovascular disease or diabetes. So that's not listed as a confounder or potential confounder anywhere, so just something to consider.
Good. All right. Are there other questions or comments? Well, I think that it may be getting close to time for an ingestive event. So we will adjourn until 1 o'clock. And that's it. Thank you all.
Great, thanks.
Wonderful presentations.